What do you do when you want to talk about some floating dude in the sky, but you can't talk about some floating dude in the sky, but you need to talk about some floating dude in the sky because some folks don't like to hear about some floating dude in the sky, but they really do need to hear about some floating dude in the sky? I'll tell you what, you need to get onto the Encountering Truth podcast so that Bill can teach you how to get around not being able to talk about some floating dude in the sky. And the worst thing about all this, Bill is a teacher and apparently wants to tell his public school students about some floating dude in the sky. Hello, I'm the Skeptic, the British floating circle that watches people make extraordinary claims, and then I explain why I don't accept what they're saying. Don't worry, I'll watch it for you. The Encountering Truth podcast was sent to me by one of you lovely lot, and then when I watched the first minute, this guy said something that made me facepalm. You'll see it too. He learned from the best, but that best just so happened to be Frank Turek. So really, it can't be that good. And what Bill learned from Frank was how it's possible to talk about a god when you can't talk about a god. And then a later revelation showed that Bill especially wants to talk about a god in the public school he works at. Well, before we hear about what we don't want to hear about, if this isn't your first Skeptic video, hit the like, the subscribe and the bell, and maybe you'll hear of other videos like this. And a super thanks to those that hit super thanks in some recent videos. Well, David. Thanks, David. Lisa the Rainbow Giraffe bestows leaves upon you. More hen. So, what even is the Encountering Truth podcast?
Where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life.
Wait, Jesus shows up to each podcast for a guest encounter? Or why hasn't this been spoken about sooner? Jesus has been here all along.
Well, I've just returned from the Cross-Examined Instructors Academy led by the great Frank Turek, held in Charlotte, North Carolina this year.
What on earth can you learn from Frank Turek? Well, other than proving God with evil and proving God without the Bible somewhat terribly.
Let's begin with a game of Taboo. Now, I don't have the cards here, but you can imagine you've all probably played the game of Taboo, where you have cards that have a word on it that you're supposed to get your teammates to guess, but you can't say the several words on that card as clues to the word that you're trying to get them to guess. So this first one is a mythical character,
Jesus,
who wants to become a real boy,
Jesus,
and the moral of the story is to tell the truth,
Jesus,
or it might show up on a particular part of your face.
Dang it, if he'd said body, I'd have thought getting wrist hammered would be punishment. Oh well, fine. Pinocchio.
If you guessed Pinocchio, you would be right. All right, the next one is as a teacher, at the end of a chapter or a unit, I might want to assess what my students have learned. So I would give them one of these, and they're oftentimes standardized.
A standard baptism.
So, and if you guessed a test for that, you would be right on.
Oh, so close.
Okay, and finally, earlier this summer, I brought my students to France and Spain. And when we got off the plane in France, in Paris, we had to go through customs and present this documentation with our photo on it.
A personal Bible?
That would be a passport, right?
Oh,
This game is actually an example of a skill that I have to teach my world language students. This skill is called circumlocution. Now, the dictionary definition of circumlocution is the use of an unnecessarily large number of words to express an idea, or evasion in speech. But it really comes from that circum meaning around, locution meaning speaking. So it's talking around an idea. So if it's in French or Spanish and one of my students don't know a word, rather than giving them that word, I would encourage them to talk around the word in order to communicate the idea of what they're trying to say.
which is great when it comes to learning languages, but if the dictionary states it's an unnecessary amount of words for other things, then I'm going to feel happy saying that in religious talk, it's unnecessary.
Now, in this game, those 3 cards were hand-picked, right? Pinocchio, test, passport, and some of the words that I couldn't say for Pinocchio were nose and grow, wooden, lie, and puppet. For test, of course, you can't say exam, you can't say quiz or SAT or school even. And then for passport, you can't say travel or visa or country or identification and so on. Okay? But there are 2 other real words in the game of Taboo, at least the copy that I have, and they are the Bible and the devil. Could you talk about the Bible without saying testament, book, swear, scriptures, or holy?
Yes. A pile of garbage piece of literature that when folks read all of it, turns them into atheists. Easy.
Could you talk about the devil without saying Satan, Lucifer, hell, pitchfork, or angel?
Yeah. The dude that will party with you for not loving a god. Oh, I'm good at this.
And then finally, what if one of the cards was God? Would you be able to talk about God without mentioning Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, Father, Savior, Lord, or Christianity?
Yeah. Sky wizard that hasn't ever met the burden of proof of its existence and therefore doesn't exist. But people will still accept it's real because that's what they've been taught by their parents.
Well, as a high school teacher, a Christian teacher in a public school, this is something that I think about a lot.
Hang on. You want to talk about a god in a place where there's supposed to be a separation of religion and state, you sneaky, sneaky bugger.
In fact, there's many people out there like me that are in a position where they can't share openly about their faith. But I'm starting to think that this idea of circumlocution is the key.
Whatever happened to not forcing religion onto people, especially the young and impressionable? I thought this was going to be a video about talking around a god, not a video about how to be a POS and teach students about something you're not meant to. Suddenly, I don't think Bill should be allowed to keep his job.
Maybe we can talk around God when we can't talk about him.
Or maybe you just keep your beliefs to yourself, especially when they can't be demonstrated to actually be true, and just teach the lessons you're there to teach.
Maybe we can lead people towards Christ when we can't lead people to him. And so in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells the parable of the sower. And he talks about the soil where the seeds of the gospel fell, whether that's along the road, on the rocky ground, among the thorns. And then he goes on to talk about the good soil.
Aren't there gardener almanacs for that kind of thing? And they're probably far better than a book that tells you that a wife is worth 200 foreskins.
This is the one who hears the word and understands it, and then bears fruit. So maybe when we are in a position where we can't actually share the seeds of the gospel, maybe we can do a little pre-work, a little gardening, a little preparing of the soil so that we can make it good soil. So when they do hear the words of the gospel, the seeds of the gospel fall on their hearts, that it lands in that good soil and it can take root and bear fruit.
I don't know, there's something particularly creepy about a man that says bear fruit when they're in a position to influence minors.
This is the essence of what Francis Schaeffer calls pre-evangelism. He says that before a man is ready to become a Christian, he must have a proper understanding of the truth. We are concerned at this point not with the content of truth so much as with the concept of what truth is.
Please don't say that what you believe is true. The very fact that faith plays such a big part in believers' lives is a demonstration of something that isn't demonstrably true.
So where do we begin? Well, in a postmodern world where relativism rules and the mantra of the day is to live your truth, well, maybe one of the most important things that we could ask is, as Pontius Pilate did so many years ago, what is truth.
And outside of the Bible, there's barely anything, or maybe nothing, to suggest that Pontius Pilate was ever a real person either. The Bible's good at that, just making people up. Pontius Pilate, supernatural Jesus, Yahweh.
This is actually a fairly easy and safe question that I could even ask my students.
Yeah, but should you? The only correct answer is no.
So we're going to start with this idea of what is truth, and we're going to kind of play this out to see what this might look like in an actual scenario. Okay, so if I had my wallet and I said I have a $20 bill in my wallet, would that be true?
Who cares? There's nothing supernatural about the claim. People have 20s in their wallets all the time, and it won't change many folks' lives by you having $20 in your wallet. And you could demonstrate the claim by opening your wallet and showing it.
Well, I believe you. You might say, I don't know. Well, I believe I have a $20 bill. Don't you believe me? Well, does believing it make it true?
Finally, no.
Of course not. What makes it true? The actual existence of a $20 bill in my wallet. This is called the correspondence theory of truth, and we've talked about it on this podcast before, but it's truth is that which aligns with or corresponds to reality. And so in order for a statement to be true, there must be a truth maker that determines its truth.
Why get fluffy with words? Just say that it exists because it can be demonstrated. Truthmaker makes it sound like you can say that someone demonstrated something, and because they didn't lie that one time, now every time they can be trusted.
And so if in a subjective truth claim, the truth maker is in the mind of the subject.
Great. In my mind is Lisa the rainbow giraffe, leaf be upon her. So that makes the giant rainbow cosmic deity suddenly exist, right?
A statement like, I like pizza, can become untrue simply by me changing my mind about it.
But saying I like pizza and then not liking pizza doesn't demonstrate the existence of pizza. I like rainbow giraffe poop. So what?
But that's not the type of truth claim that we're talking about here, is it? If it were, then I could just change my mind about what was in my wallet and I could become rich. No, we are making an objective truth claim. And so the truth maker relies on the actual object, the existence of a $20 bill in my wallet. So even if I told you it were a $50 bill, that would still be an objective truth claim. It would just be a false objective truth claim.
Right. Good. 10 points, Gryffindor.
Right? Because it's not a $50 bill, it's just a $20 bill. Okay? So that'd be wishful thinking, right? So as Doug Groteis says, a statement is never true simply because someone thinks it or utters it. We may be entitled to our own opinions, but we are not entitled to our own facts. Believing a statement is one thing, that statement being true is another. So that is the difference between subjective and objective truth. Objective being true or false, regardless of what anybody thinks about it. Okay? So the next question is, can we actually know objective truth? Well, before we dive into that, we have to understand we should not confuse our desire for absolute certainty with the simple ability to be able to know something. Okay, for instance, when you get on a plane and fly somewhere, are you absolutely certain that it's going to get you there?
I'm not sure what all this gish-galloping has to do with the existence of a god, or how you can get away with talking about a god with students.
Are you absolutely certain that it's gone through the proper maintenance checks? That the pilot has been properly trained and gotten enough sleep and is sober?
I'm pretty certain they have checks for that. And backups.
When you sit down in a chair, are you absolutely certain that it's going to hold you up or continue holding you up without collapsing underneath you? No.
Well, given how many times chairs have collapsed under me, I think it's fair to say that I have a reasonable expectation, given my previous experience, that a chair will hold me up and that a plane will get me to my destination. If I'm worried about the opposite, I'd never sit down or go on holiday/vacation.
But the thing is that nobody walks through life needing absolute certainty in every area of life, right? In fact, we convict criminals all the time, not with absolute certainty, but beyond a reasonable doubt. We look at all the evidence and we make a rational, reasonable conclusion from that evidence.
Apart from supernatural claims, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to back it up. Not, well, you can't prove that X isn't true.
So let's apply this to something else, okay? Look at the building that you're in, okay? Does that building exist? Well, yes, of course it does, right? Okay, well, how do you know that? Well, maybe I'm in it, but it existed before you got there.
Not forever it didn't. There are deeds and plans that demonstrate when it came into existence and by whom in most cases.
Right, and your rationality believed it enough, told you to believe it in order to go there, right? So the next question is, did that building just pop into existence out of thin air? Of course not.
If you have God deeds and plans for how God exists, and not from something that claims it to exist, then I'll be listening.
How do we know that? Well, because our rationality tells us that things don't just come into existence without a cause.
Except for a God, because apparently the rules change for that thing.
So, what could have caused the building that you're in or looking at? Okay. Could nature have caused it? No, right? How do we know that? Well, because there's obviously an element of design to it.
If this is what you learned from Turek, I'd ask for a refund, mate.
And so design needs a designer. Now, what would be the first thing that someone would need to do to design or build that building? Okay. Buy the land? Draw up the blueprints? No, actually, before all of that, they would have to choose to design and build that building. And to choose requires a mind, right? And that mind would have to be intelligent enough to design and build it, okay? It would have to be powerful enough and have the ability to build it, okay? You would need the space or the land to build it on and the time to do it and all of the materials, or at least some way to make it all, right, to obtain it. And so how do we know all this? Well, we reason from effect the building itself and the design in the building back to the most logical, reasonable cause, which would be a designer or builder.
But where did the designer or builder come from? Yes, it is a valid question.
So that's what science does all the time, isn't it? Reasoning from effect back to a logical cause. Okay, so the next question, does all knowledge come from science? Well, at first we say, well, yes, of course. That's how we know everything, right? But in a 1998 debate with Dr. Peter Atkins, philosopher William Lane Craig identified 5 things that science cannot account for, but that we are all rational enough to believe. Okay? Number 1 would be logical and mathematical truths. Science actually presupposes logic and math, so to use science to prove them would be arguing in a circle. Okay? Next would be metaphysical truths, like there are other minds out there besides my own, or that the external world exists, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Okay? Then he goes on to say that ethical beliefs about statements of value, like morals, cannot be proven by science. Science cannot account for them. You cannot use the scientific method to prove what the Nazis did was wrong, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I bet you could. I'm sure there could be chemical explanations for empathy and understanding for basic human rights.
Then, what about aesthetic judgments about beauty? Beauty itself is inaccessible by the scientific method. Okay? And then, finally, science itself is loaded with unproven assumptions, unprovable assumptions, right? So now that might be the end of the class or the conversation that you might have with someone. But let's take a look at what we accomplished during that conversation. Okay, number one, we talked about the difference between subjective and objective truth, right? Where objective, the truth maker lies in the object, not in the subject's mind. So it's true or false, regardless of what someone believes about it.
Right. I'll accept that something is or isn't true, regardless of whether someone believes or accepts it to be true. But I don't understand how a God fits into all this.
That there is no my truth and your truth. There's only the truth. Okay? We also talked about how truth is knowable. Even without absolute certainty, truth is knowable. We can know the truth. Okay? And then we discussed the idea of reasoning from effect back to a logical cause. And we basically laid the groundwork for the Kalam cosmological argument.
But nothing that you said so far explains how that extremely terrible argument is true. There are tons and tons of videos explaining why that can't be accepted as the correct explanation, including several on this channel from one circular dumbass.
Okay, which says that everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. And we related all of that to the building. Okay, and that is an argument for the existence of God.
When will we get to change that to everything that exists has an explanation for its existence?
Finally, we talked about how not all truth comes from science. Okay? In the next class or conversation or whatever that we might have with people, we might bring up things like, why does math work?
The same reason science does. It's demonstrable.
Where do human rights come from? We talked about that in one episode a while back. What makes something right or wrong? Can life come from non-life? Is the universe fine-tuned for human life? You can talk about, is DNA a coded message? Or we could even talk about, what is the meaning of life? Okay? These are all good and safe questions that we can broach with to kind of push people towards Christ, lead people towards Christ when we can't lead people to Christ. Now, some people might say, well, what does this have to do with evangelism, with leading people to Jesus? Well, as Francis Schaeffer says, all the cultural, intellectual, or philosophic material is not to be separated from leading people to Christ. He goes on to say that talking about metaphysics, morals, and epistemology is part of my evangelism. Okay? And he says that in The God Who Is There. So in those times when we feel like maybe we can't be the ones to actually plant the seeds of the gospel, maybe, like we said, we can do a little bit of pre-work, a little bit of gardening.
Yeah, but unless the person expresses an absolute interest, you really shouldn't even do that.
Preparing that soil, making good soil ready to hear the gospel, so that when they do hear the gospel, when that gospel seed falls on their hearts, that it falls on good soil, that it takes root, and that it sprouts up and bears fruit. So we might not be able to plant it ourselves, but we can certainly be part of the harvest. So all of this is great stuff to consider if you find yourself in a position where you might not be able to share openly about your faith, or if it's just a little bit uncomfortable for you to start talking outright about God. Start with these things, because there are so many false truths in people's minds today. Like, people might accept Christianity. Well, why can't all religions be true? Well, because they make contradictory claims that, one religion says that Jesus is not the Son of God, the other says he is. They can't both be true.
And what about the religions that don't mention Jesus at all? I guess you have to presuppose that supernatural Jesus was real first to then get the right religion. Right?
Okay. Islam says that Jesus did not die on the cross. Christianity says that he did. They cannot both be true. All roads do not lead to heaven.
So how on earth do you determine how your one is true?
Jesus says that I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except through me. So there's all sorts of false ideas out there.
But you have to accept that it is really what was said, and that the Bible's accurate and is the word of a God, which cannot be demonstrated. So now you just believe it to be true, and we're back to square one. And those poor students have to endure your rambling when in reality, you shouldn't be finding excuses to push your religion onto anyone, especially not in a public school. I don't know, I was enjoying the video until I heard that little bit, then I kind of just got irritated. But maybe that's out of order, and you think he should be free to sneakily tell his students about his beliefs. Let me know in the section below. I'm going to skeptic this as a ridiculous way of ignoring the need for separation between religion and government. A big thank you to this month's top-level ticks on Patreon. Jerry, Dark Ether Piao, Tamo, The Barely Bearable Atheist, George, Godless Granny, Addy Rockhart, The Enixes, Jakari, Elizabeth, Whiskey Tech Fred, and Rick, as well as all the $3 base ticks. You can become a supporter on Patreon too at patreon.com/theskeptic. The link is in the description, along with links to all my other socials. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. From me, the Skeptic, stay safe, keep thinking logically, and ask questions. Skepticism is the first step towards truth. See you next Saturday.